This podcast comes to you from the University of Toronto, Mississauga. We wish to acknowledge this land on which the university operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island. We are grateful to work on this land, and we strive toward peace and reconciliation among all peoples. Hi, I'm Jill Caskey, Associate Professor of Art History at the University of Toronto, Mississauga. Welcome to Medieval Art Matters, a podcast that showcases the vitality of contemporary research on the Middle Ages. In each episode, we invite scholars to talk about critical issues that shaped the experiences of people living centuries ago and that still matter today. I'm joined by my co-hosts and collaborators, Adam Cohen, Linda Safran, and Erika Loic. Adam, Linda, and I have been working for a long time on a textbook called Art and Architecture of the Middle Ages, Exploring a Connected World. Erika Loic came on board a few years ago to help conceptualize and create the website that accompanies the book. We'll be joined by our guest, Professor Alexandra Gillespie, in a moment. But first, who we are and why we started this project.
Hi, I'm Linda Safran, currently at the Pontifical Institute of Medieval Studies in Toronto, and formerly a faculty member at the University of Toronto and the Catholic University of America. I've studied and published on art across the Middle Ages: Jewish art, Christian art, Islamic art, and architecture. I'm interested in all of it. I'm especially interested in things on the edge. Southern Italy, where there's Greek culture and Latin culture and Islamic culture. I'm obsessed with Central Asia, where I've been privileged to travel as part of this textbook research. There are so many interesting places on the medieval map that are not Gothic France. My own work has been mostly in Southern Italy, which is off the maps of the Byzantinists because it's too Western, and off the maps of the Western Europeanists because it's too Byzantine. So this book was a great opportunity to make sure that areas that aren't especially well represented in traditional books, including Byzantine art, which generally gets half a chapter in an intro textbook, make sure that Islamic arts, Jewish arts, and arts of polytheistic cultures get, if not equal representation, at least much more representation than they have historically received. My view of what counts as art, what kinds of products have an added aesthetic value and are invested with greater meaning, can include things that are as prosaic as coins. Coins tell us a huge amount about history. Ceramics can tell us about technologies that are available and interests of the producers and consumers. So in our book, we have things like coins and bowls, wedding rings, spoons, tombstones. We really push our geographical borders to include the expected areas like Western Europe, but also all of the areas that were contiguous with it or even not contiguous with it. We go to the borders of China and in one or two cases even past that. We go to the borders of India. We cover the area that Alexander the Great covered, plus Western Europe and Northern Europe, which he didn't manage to get to. We include the span of the Roman Empire, the Sasanian Empire. And so in doing so, we go much farther east and south than traditional textbooks do. And that enriches our stories also for the Western European core, as most people will think of it.
I'm Adam Cohen, and I'm an associate professor in the art history department at the University of Toronto. I'm especially fascinated by medieval books and their illuminations and what those pictures can tell us about what was meaningful to people in the Middle Ages. In my own research, I've mostly studied books that were made and used by men and women from Christian monasteries, So primarily religious books, but also ones that were very much involved in wrestling with philosophical and intellectual problems of the time. But most recently, I've been turning my attention to Hebrew illuminated manuscripts, which is a subject that has not received a lot of attention by scholars of medieval art history. All of the books that are available for students to read and for teachers to assign tend to have a very evolutionary trajectory, that they march inexorably without pause to reach the pinnacle of French Gothic architecture. And that is just too limited a view. I think it doesn't do justice to all the other kinds of art in the Middle Ages. And I don't think that it gives us enough purchase on the kinds of experience that individuals had when they made and used books, which were a very intimate medium. We worked very hard not to try and tell a single story, to make everything start at the beginning and work in lockstep fashion to a predetermined end, that eventually we'd get to the Renaissance and we made it. As if people at the end of the Middle Ages were just saying to themselves, if only the Renaissance would get here already, then life would be great again. People in the Middle Ages, like they do in every period, just mostly live their lives. And what they do is use all kinds of tools, including art and architecture, to tell stories about themselves and to communicate the things that are important to themselves. By looking and studying those things from different points of view, we can get at the richness of that historical moment in a way that previous survey textbooks have not done.
Hi, it's Jill Caskey again. I first started becoming interested in the Middle Ages because I was convinced that there were stories that could be told about it that were not wrapped up exclusively in the church and in the elites who ran the church or were subservient to it. And so I began looking for alternative cultures, I would say, that had flourished and developed their own architectural and artistic cultures that spoke about their experiences rather than these larger paradigms that had shaped the fields before, where all of medieval art was either that commissioned by kings and queens or bishops, abbots, and so on. I've always thought that there had to be more stories located within this larger history of medieval art. And so initially that was my goal, was to get in there and tell these other stories. And I first found the best place that I wanted to tell them was in the south of Italy, this territory that is on the edges and also at the center of things. As Linda already described, it's on the peripheries of what constitutes Western Europe, and therefore completely outside of the canon of Western medieval and early modern art. Yet at the same time, it's an incredibly rich place because it's located kind of right smack dab in the middle of the Mediterranean. So it's a place of incredible cultural fluidity for the people who lived there and flourished there for many centuries, but also for all of the various people who sought to rule it. And it's a place that saw wave after wave after wave of conquest, colonization, and migration from ancient Greek and earlier times on. So for the Middle Ages, it becomes this place where different polities are competing for the turf. Islamic rulers from North Africa coming in and seizing control of Sicily for 200 years and operating also in the mainland in various smaller periods of time. Byzantines from Constantinople also were there competing for power. The Normans from Normandy in France conquered southern Italy and Sicily at the same time they conquered England, although a lot of people who are obsessed with William the Conqueror and 1066 in England have no idea that, in fact, the Normans ruled the South for so long. And then the Germans came in, and then the French. And so there's layer upon layer upon layer of people coming in, ruling this place, often bringing in their own kind of traditional modes of art production from their original homes and imposing them on this landscape. So a lot of my work has been about what happens when those people come in from above and impose this model of artistic production or architectural production or religious perspectives or social perspectives. What happens when they come in and impose that on people on the ground? And what happens to those people on the ground when they begin to absorb all of these waves of migration that cause constant change on the terrain? So I've been interested in this area in part because it really is so unstable. It completely throws up in the air a lot of the conventional notions about what happens in European art. Those norms just don't fit.
The website is a critical part of the project, which is why we brought Erika on board.
My name is Erika Loic, and I'm currently the Assistant Professor of Global Medieval Art at Florida State University. I'm the content curator and graphic designer, as well as one of the main writers for artofthemiddleages.com. Part of the reason working on the website was so important to me was the opportunity to rethink the teaching of medieval art history as something that can be collaborative and evolving, and also to explore how digital tools might allow students to find objects and monuments that really speak to them. I think that anybody who has taught non-experts before recognizes some of the benefits to presenting things chronologically. I'm not proposing that we need to dump chronologies and canons and surveys necessarily. But what I think is that we need to give students and non-experts different ways to approach the same material. So a textbook can provide that chronological anchor that keeps non-experts from feeling completely lost. But a website can give them the power to take those same materials and rearrange them according to themes that may be important to them. And that can be something as simple as materials, types of objects. So if you find you have a passion for textiles, maybe you want to filter all of that content through the lens of textiles. But maybe you find you have a passion for gender and you want to filter everything not by any particular type of object or part of the world or time period, but some gender-related theme. And so the idea with the textbook is not to have it stand alone, and same with the website, not to have it stand alone, but to have these as complements so that you can work through material in multiple ways, bring in different voices. And that's a large part of this podcast as well. I'm really excited to see where it takes us, how we can use it to add even more voices and perspectives to the website.
We've invited Professor Alex Gillespie to help address the concept of the Middle Ages from her perspective as a scholar of English literature and medieval books. She is Vice President of the University of Toronto and Principal of the University of Toronto, Mississauga, where she has worked as a professor of English and medieval studies for the past 17 years. Her research is interdisciplinary in approach and international in scope. She combines tradition with innovation, old books with new scientific technologies. Her expertise ranges from Middle English paleography to micro-CT scanning, from the poetics of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales to the fungi found on printed pages in China. Her publications have uncovered a diversity of stories about literatures, cultures, and ecologies across the medieval and pre-modern worlds. And she has consistently questioned how such period labels as medieval and pre-modern give shape to global pasts.
Welcome, Professor Gillespie, and thank you so much for being on our show. Could you tell us a bit about how you conceptualize the Middle Ages in time and space?
First of all, I want to say hello, and thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this podcast, and in that way to be a part of what I think is a really exciting project to think about teaching and learning about art of the Middle Ages, but to think about it in a way that's kind of fluid and dynamic, allows for change, allows for innovation, allows for a pushing at boundaries at exactly a moment where I think that's what we need in our field of medieval studies, and maybe even more broadly in our field of humanities research. So the question that you asked me, Linda, the first question, doesn't get much bigger than that for a medievalist. Where are the Middle Ages in time and in space? It's pretty existential. I think I would start by saying that on some level, I don't believe in the Middle Ages. For the listeners at home, they look shocked. They're making Edvard Munch scream faces at me. If only we could put emojis into a podcast. They're shocked that I don't believe in the Middle Ages. But what do I mean when I say I don't believe in the Middle Ages? I'm going to start by acknowledging, I started my PhD very much as a medievalist who wanted to push at the boundaries of what that meant. I went to the University of Oxford from my home in New Zealand. You'll hear twang in my accent, to work on the writing of Geoffrey Chaucer. But as those writings influenced the writings of early modern poets like Edmund Spenser and perhaps even William Shakespeare, though I wasn't sure if I would go quite that far. That seemed too canon for me. I was really interested in the way in which we drew this rigid boundary between the period we called the early modern and the period we called the medieval, because it seemed to me that what Chaucer was doing in his writing and the way in which Edmund Spenser, the writer, was borrowing from Chaucer and kind of riffing off him suggested that boundary didn't actually make much sense, even in the terms of English literary history. To put it another way, that the early modern was shaped around the medieval in some really powerful ways, and I hadn't been given the tools to understand those as I'd gone through my undergraduate degree, and I wanted to understand it better. I ended up discovering that the book might be a way to understand that, because the book that Spenser read his Chaucer in, what was that? What relationship did it bear to the past? When he was reading Chaucer, who was a writer who lived entirely in a manuscript culture, who died 50 years before the Western adoption of the technology of printing, and I use the word adoption advisedly, the Western development, shall we say, of the technology of printing, which had long been used in other parts of the globe, but was developed, commercially in Europe in about 1450, and Chaucer died in 1400. So Chaucer lived exclusively in a manuscript culture, but Spenser was reading Chaucer's writing in printed form. And there was so much to untangle there, because we associate printing with certain kinds of modernity, with certain kinds of capitalism, with the sale of books and the mass dissemination of knowledge, with the change that follows from that, change in the way that ideas are perhaps democratized. Do we all think that printing democratized ideas? Do we all think, for example, as I was taught, that printing led to the enlightenment of thought? But the rest of my career has also been about looking at the edges of this idea of the Middle Ages from different perspectives, and seeing where it doesn't work or how it doesn't work. To try to round this out, try to make sense of this thing that I'm describing troubling from the moment I even begin to answer the question. I'm really interested in the way that our discipline is formed around an idea, and it is just an idea, that belongs to a particular institutional and disciplinary history that has its roots, that is deeply entangled in the early modern period and in Renaissance, through into settler colonialism and into conceptions of modernity, through into the formation of our disciplines in the universities of the 19th century and right through into modern times, of a period in time that begins with something like the fall of the Roman Empire. For the listeners at home, I'm doing scare quotes in the air right now. The fall of the Roman Empire, as if it's a particular moment in time, maybe the 4th century, maybe the 5th century, something like that. And that ends perhaps with the fall of Constantinople. And I feel like I need even bigger scare quotes when I say fall of Constantinople, because perhaps I should say the liberation of Constantinople. But there is this period between maybe the 4th century and maybe the 15th century, which we could call the Middle Ages, something in between. We formed a whole disciplinary practice around that period. And we have all sorts of ideas, forms of knowledge, cultural institutions, and I should say, wonderful tools for the study of cultural production, including art and literature, invested in that idea in that period. And I don't think we can just chuck that out. I think we need it, even as we trouble it. We need it in part to understand why we formed that idea in the first place, why we think in those terms. Because of course we don't have to. As I just said, we could think of the fall of Constantinople as the beginning of something. We could also think, instead of thinking about the period between the fall of Rome and the fall of Constantinople, we could think about the period beginning with the rise of Islam and ending with, I don't know, the beginning of slavery. We could think of marking out time according to the various epochs of ancient Chinese history. We could mark the world's changes according to the mass pandemics that rolled across Eurasia. That would seem very timely thing to do through the last 2 millennia. We could measure time and map out and stake out space in so many different ways, but we choose to do it in this particular way between, Rome and Constantinople, or between the end of the classical period and the beginning of the thing that, at least in the 19th century, got called Renaissance. I look at the beautiful works of art that you've assembled and the way in which our field is able to assemble those works of art and talk about them in relation to one another in enormously productive ways. So really good things have come out of this formation, right? But why do I think we have that formation? Well, a lot of it has to do with white supremacy, right? It's the idea that good things come from Rome, that period where, when you dig up the statues, they're really, really white. And you can think about the idea of the rise of democracy, not in terms of muddled things that might happen in 12th century England or in parts of India in the 18th century or whatever. You can just think about them in a nice, simple way, do those nice Italian people with their white statues in Rome in late antiquity. And you can sort of ignore all that muddled period where, for example, really key ideas from Greece and Rome get transmitted through the Islamic traditions. Just sort of ignore that, and you can focus instead on Renaissance, on when they get their way back to Europe and where Europe takes charge of them again. And then you can imagine that as leading a sort of a narrative of Western European triumphalism, which ends with Western European dominance of the world. And you can think about that as intellectual progress and cultural progress, instead of thinking about it as you might alternatively, as I said, you might think instead about the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade in the middle of the 15th century, or the forms of colonialism that begin with Columbus's journey across the seas at the end of the 15th century. And that is really being the grounding narrative of Western domination of the globe, instead of the grounding narrative being one about Renaissance and the rebirth of knowledge from Rome, right? The Middle Ages is really, really important to the way in which we choose to conceive of the West's cultural triumph, if we even believe in the West's cultural triumph. So on the one hand, this disciplinary formation has, like any way of putting together art and ideas and so on, has the potential to generate knowledge in so many different ways and directions. On the other hand, there's all kinds of ideology tangled up in it. I think we need to think about it for both those reasons, for its productiveness and also for some of those ideological strains that perhaps in the past we haven't paid as much attention to as we could and should have.
I wanted to pick up on another thing that you just said, where you're talking about certain narratives that this era brings forward that can be used for nefarious purposes, maybe, or particular ideological purposes today, or 50 years ago, or 100 years ago, or 200 years ago, whatever. And to some extent, the way that our fields have been shaped, they're prioritizing very specific works of art or very specific texts. And when we were writing our textbook, we spent so much time wrestling with what should go in the book. And, should we expand the canon, for instance, or should we just toss the whole thing out? And so, I get a sense in a way of what you think about the canon in your field, but I wonder how you do view it. Supplementing it, throwing it out, where does it stand in your mind now?
canon. Well, it's a bit like Middle Ages, right? On the one hand, I'm like, canon, so interesting. We should study it and try to figure out why we even have it. Like, what's the point of that? We do have it. It's there. It happened, and it keeps happening. So what is its utility? What is it doing? Why is it there? Why does it matter? So I do Chaucer, and one of the things that we say about great works of art or literature is that I can go back to Chaucer year after year, and every time I go back to him, there's still this thrill or shock. There's certainly something in his aesthetic that is shattering of my expectations and transformative of my relationship to the world, my own relationship to my world right now, that makes me want to read his writing. And that has never gone away, even though the first time I read him, I was 19 years old, and now I am much older than that. I still don't have, and I have yet to read a completely satisfactory account of why it is the case that some art seems able to achieve that better than other art, and that as at different cultures in different times in different spaces find particular works of art that can do that, and those cultures, quite often quite different cultures over different times and different spaces, will turn to the same work of art and find that it has that capacity. So on the one hand, I'm like, these are all drifting towards a quite essentializing definition of canon, which is some art is just really good, and I don't want to deny anyone in the whole world access to that amazing art. However, it is also obviously the case that these works come to us pre-selected, they come to us framed, they come to us for all the reasons that I started to outline, to do with choices that are made, narratives that are told, and to the violent exclusion of other works of art that could also speak to us with the same eloquence, that could also capture and transform us. So on the one hand, I would say we should think about what art is and what does, and canon is part of that. On the other hand, I lead towards we should think about canon because we need to understand the frameworks that produce canon, the construction of canon, the ideological work that canon does, the political work that canon does, the violence that canon quite often represents, the violent exclusions that it represents. And what I would also say is that in terms of my own work, the way that that's worked is that on the one hand, I continue to try to finish my book called Chaucer's Books, which has lots of readings of my beloved Chaucer. And that book is also about the way he thinks about the book. But then the whole rest of my career is just involved kind of smashing that up. And as Adam said in his very generous introduction, I'm also now working entirely collaboratively, because I can only ever be a non-expert in these spaces, working on Dunhuang printed books from the 10th century and working on Korean printed materials from the 14th century, and reading Kashmiri texts from the 17th century so that I can understand the books that bear those texts, and really just opening up myself to the texts that are not from my background, whatever that means, the art that doesn't belong to my canon, whatever that is, and just trying to start challenging some of those notions as well.
Professor Gillespie, and I emphasize professor here in the question I'm about to ask. Earlier, you talked about troubling the definitions of the Middle Ages in time and space. And troubling also means making the story more complicated, which is something that students don't always want in an introductory course or text. So is there anything else that you think people should know or keep in mind, and especially people who are completely new to the Middle Ages, in favor of making and keeping history complicated?
It's so much more beautiful when it's complicated. I'm actually thinking about Indigenous beadwork when you ask that question. Even the most simple Indigenous beadwork is not simple, it's extremely complicated. And it's in its complexity and the complexity of the stories that it tells, in its deep histories and the kinship that it marks out between its maker and its maker's kin and so on, so complex and rich. That's true of art of all kinds, right? That beautiful art is always complicated. Bear with it, bear with the complexity. I'm one of those people who, when I'm really tired at the end of the week, I very often will think, I just want to watch something on Netflix that's totally mindless. And yet, when I watch such a piece of art, I shall call it that, and it's actually not sufficiently complex, it doesn't actually satisfy me. It doesn't do what I want it to do. Even when we think we want simplicity, the things that take hold of us and that we return to again and again, including for comfort, are often so rich and deep and complex. We don't always want to think through why that is. We don't necessarily want to unpack or describe that complexity, but we want to be able to register it on this kind of perceptual level, even if not a cognitive level. We want to feel it. We want to experience it. And that's the same with the past. A simple version of the past, it might be like, oh yeah, like that kind of makes sense and so on. But a richer, more complex version of the past is ultimately so much more satisfying, it gives you so much more. Bear with it. We fell into the danger of the single story to a very significant extent, I think, and that's changing now. It will take a while before that new, richer, more complex story is in a form that can be perceived rather than anxiously, troublingly thought about. But it's going to be worth it. The new story of the past we will tell is like, it's like a better medicine, right? It will be good medicine. It will be better for us. It will be better for more people. So that's what I think.
I love that. Thank you so much.
And this was a pleasure for us. Thank you.
Inshallah.
Thank you, Professor Gillespie, for coming to speak with us today. It's been a real pleasure.
That was really energizing. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.
That was Professor Alexandra Gillespie of the University of Toronto, Mississauga, on the benefits of conceptualizing history in more expansive ways.
You've been listening to an episode of Medieval Art Matters, hosted by Jill Caskey, Adam S. Cohen, Erika Loic, and me, Linda Safran. This podcast was inspired by our book, Art and Architecture of the Middle Ages, Exploring a Connected World, published by Cornell University Press. For more information, go to our website, artofthemiddleages.com, where you'll find more podcasts in this series.
Medieval Art Matters is made possible by the support of the Department of Art History at the University of Toronto, St. George Campus, and the Office of the Vice Principal, Academic, and Dean, University of Toronto, Mississauga. Music is courtesy of the Toronto Consort.
This podcast was brought to you by Cited Media Productions. Thanks for listening.
You have been listening to a Cited Media production. CIDED. Find out more at citedmedia.ca.